Why catastrophism? Why bring this subject up and use it as an explanation for tons of events that happened in our ancestors' past? And by that I mean finding an explanation as to why all of the ancient cultures across the planet, for some weird reason, all have these fantastical stories. All of those crazy myths and legends of gods fighting and massive earthquakes and tsunamis and mountains of water, etc. These stories pop up everywhere, but they are immediately discarded by the mainstream historical institutions because they don't seem to make any sense or have any basis in reality. So if you are a researcher trying to do honest research and truly trying to figure out what happened back in the past, like why do our ancestors have all of these stories, you immediately hit a dead end from the mainstream. Now, the alternative research side is a little better, but they make the exact same mistake. They also discard a lot of this stuff because, once again, the legends and stories just sound too crazy. Like, how could you possibly believe that any of these stories took place? Like, what are you talking about when you say two gods are fighting in the sky above you, right? I mean, we have no precedence in today's sky for anything like that. It must be fake, right? It must be fiction. Taking this perspective immediately closes all the doors to actually trying to figure out what our ancestors were talking about when they were recording these histories. And to be honest, taking that stance when you look at all of our ancestors' histories is fairly insulting to them, because when they were writing it, they were not writing this stuff for entertainment. Nowhere in any of these stories are said, oh yeah, we're just writing this because we're bored and it's funny. They don't ever say that. These are the literal histories of all of our ancestors. I think they'd probably be fairly disgusted with all of us not paying attention to what they took the time and effort to record and preserve. Now, a big part of what they recorded and what they preserved is all based in catastrophism. Catastrophism, from their perspective, explains why we find all the civilizations in the situations we find them in, right? Why did civilizations disappear? Why did certain ones rise up? Why did certain migrations of people happen, etc., etc.? Catastrophism, as described by all of our ancestors, literally answers all of these questions. And then we find ourselves in the unfortunate position of completely discarding everything that they talk about. On this channel, what I'm doing is, my goal was to present intermediate to more advanced concepts with respect to catastrophism as an explanation of what happened to our ancestors. But one of the things I've actually started getting feedback on is that this kind of a situation is still so very much unknown to the general population, and that goes for even the alternative research population as well. So that's fine. All right, my bad. So the reason why I was starting this channel out as more of an intermediate to advanced catastrophism sort of situation was because there's already a ton of really good channels out there that cover a lot of the basics, and they do a much better job than I have time to ever do anyways. So I figured that I would take the next step and I would try to go over the more intermediate to advanced stuff that you don't see all that often. But what I'm finding is that even getting to the basic channels that describe and talk about the basic concepts of catastrophism, a lot of people aren't probably being suggested those channels either. In fact, I have a feeling you have to really go looking for stuff, and I know whatever YouTube's algorithm is, I don't know what the hell it does, but I have a feeling it's probably not recommending a lot of people a catastrophism type of channel unless you're doing a ton of searches that are pinpointed in that category. So what I wanted to cover here was an explanation of why catastrophism is a fantastic explanation for pretty much every major event in human history in the past 6 to 10 to 12,000 years or so. So if you are already on board with catastrophism and already understand a lot of the basics, you can stop this video here and move on with life. I mean, feel free to listen to it to gain further perspective and to enhance critical thinking skills. I mean, perspective is always helpful regardless, even if it's at a fundamental level. But this video is more designed for the person who is either A, really has no idea what catastrophism is about and why you would incorporate it into our historical timelines, and B, for the kind of person who is highly skeptical, which is good. You need to stay skeptical. I'm not trashing on skepticism. In fact, I demand it, especially if you're going to be employing critical thinking skills. But for the person who is highly skeptical and or even doesn't want anything to do with it because it goes against their current worldview, right? A lot of the stuff that deals with catastrophism relative to ancient history, it goes 100% against the grain with respect to how mainstream paints the picture of our ancient ancestors' stories. All of these legends and myths, etc., at first glance, they seem impossible. They seem crazy. They just seem like bouts of fiction and fantasy. And our ancestors must have all been crazy, right? To come up with all of this stuff and then worship it, right? They even integrated all of this craziness into their life. So here what I want to do is I want to go over why this stuff is not as crazy as it sounds, and then also go over some of the details that kind of begin to prove some of the catastrophism using science, so that for those of you who are brand new to the subject, you'll get some good tidbits of information here that you can carry on into this channel and other channels. But also for those skeptics who really do demand and should demand some sort of a realistic scientific explanation that would explain why our ancestors have the kind of stories that they have. Now, the good news is that we have a ton of science on our side that can actually begin to prove what our ancestors were talking about. We have tons of that, thankfully. The interesting thing is that the mainstream ends up having none of this, but we, for whatever reason, find that the majority of people will go along with the mainstream narrative, even though the mainstream narrative does not have any actual science to back up their claims. And we suffer the opposite problem in catastrophe, right? So we have tons of scientific evidence that corroborates the alternative look at things, the catastrophism look at ancient history, but all of that stuff is pushed aside. Why is that stuff pushed aside? Well, there's a few reasons, and I'll cover them. You know what? I'm not going to hold back on this one. This is important. So the first reason is that to the modern person's sensibilities, and I really mainly talk more about people who are Westernly trained. I get that there are other people in the world that actually believe and listened to their ancestors' stories, so this isn't a problem for them. So this is more for your mindset if you are classically Westernly trained. So for those who fall into this category, the reality is a lot of the stuff involved in catastrophism, many of the events described by our ancestors that deal with catastrophism are simply crazy. I mean, relative to what you think you know scientifically now, anything that those people were talking about in the past seems absolutely fantastical. When we hear God stories about, Zeus throwing thunderbolts and all this crazy stuff happening in the sky, when we look up at the sky now, none of that is happening. In fact, none of it. There's not even like a semblance of anything that's talked about in our ancient ancestors' histories that is happening now. So when we hear the crazy stuff, we're like, what, these people must have been dumb. They're just crazy, they don't understand basic science, and they're just making up stories, and this is what their stories were, and for whatever reason, those stories got heavily ingrained into their cultures, and it became a religion and blah, 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 right? And that attitude has been 100% reinforced by general Western media and general Western sensibilities, right? So Western people, they believe they have a really solid scientific foundation of knowledge, right? We follow the science. Yes, we will have fun with fantasy stuff, but we can generally split apart the fantasy from the science. Now, the problem with this is that today's science is now more based on theoretical principles rather than scientific method and observable fact. This is an objective truth, right? So everybody, like the mainstream right now, believes that Einstein is 100% correct, and God help you if you go against him, right? But a lot of the stuff that everybody sits there and spouts about the Einsteinian point of view with relativity and all of that, a lot of it is still based in theoretical work. We do not have the experimental data and observational data to 100% prove it. Now, the good news is at least it still has the tag theory appended to the word, the theory of relativity, but it certainly isn't approached or taught like that. Relativity is taught as a fact. Now, this video is not going to get into any of that stuff. What I'm pointing out is that if you claim to be a person of science, everything I just said, you have to objectively admit is true. Right? Now, I'm not going to go any further with that. I'm just pointing out that even something in our culture that seems to be 100% real, we don't have the actual evidence to prove that it is. So imagine that mindset now being transcribed over into the historical aspect of our sciences and knowledge. And that's exactly what has happened. So we now have establishments all over this planet that have no problem telling us how things were exactly 6,000 years ago, or how things were 20 million years ago. Hell, you can even find videos where you have these guys talking about how they know exactly what was happening like 1.6 billion years ago. That is insanity. All right, that is literal scientific insanity. We have no clue what happened 1.6 billion years ago. We don't even know what happened last year in a lot of times, right? There's plenty of cases to where we can't even prove what happened last year. And you're going to tell me what happened 1.6 billion years ago? You've lost your mind. You're out of your mind. Anyway, so this mindset has found a home in historical research. Now, the problem with this approach is that we have allowed people in perceived positions of authority dictate to us how things were in the past that they technically have no idea about. Right? That's just what we run into nowadays. And now that we've had decades of this, you could probably easily argue sort of maybe a century plus of institutions telling us, not showing us, telling us how things were in the past, that once a lie is told enough times, it becomes the truth. So if you're alive today, you have probably 100 plus years of lying going on that has now become ingrained in our culture as the truth. This mindset is objectively bad. It's objective poison. But what we find is many historians have no problem drinking that poison and then giving it to other people. This is an objectively bad way to do science, and it's an objectively bad way to approach history. There is no way to argue this fact. If you haven't noticed, I am not going to sugarcoat any of the stuff going on right now in our society. The reality is we are in a lot of trouble, and one of the reasons that we are in a lot of trouble is because we have allowed people in positions of authority to tell us how things happened in the past without showing us any evidence to prove that they're correct. And you are also not allowed to go and test their evidence, right? There are no new digs in areas where there should be all kinds of digs going on that could help clarify a lot of the problems that we have in archaeology, for example, because they've shut them down, right? These authoritative positions have literally just shut down other researchers from trying to get in there and prove another perspective or even build up the current one, right? Now that the current perspective exists for many cultures across this planet, that's it. It's locked in. It is done. And there is no way to generate or gain an alternative perspective on that new mainstream story because you're not allowed to. Right? You're just not allowed to go do it anymore. You cannot question the authorities. That is not how we do history, and that is not how we do science. So, what does this have to do with catastrophism? All right, I've rambled enough. So, here's the thing with catastrophism. As we study other ancient cultures, one of the things that we inevitably run into is, of course, their myths, legends, heroes, etc., right? We don't have full, complete knowledge of everybody's stuff, unfortunately. Time has absolutely destroyed quite a lot of that, as well as the catastrophes that we will discuss here in a second. That has done a great job at also clearing the slate for history, which also has its own implications on why we are where we are now. We'll get to that later. But catastrophism matters because every single ancient culture that exists, that we have a history of their myths and legends, which is ultimately their real history, they all talk about catastrophism. I mean, that's it. The reality is every single ancient culture that we are aware of has tons of stories about catastrophic events going on around them during the time of their civilizations. And what's interesting is that the mainstream never asks why. Why does every culture talk about these incredible events? Why does every single ancient culture describe these amazing shows in the sky, right? We have everything from mountains of water traveling across continents, earthquakes that are literally sinking and raising continents. We have gods in the sky battling it out. And all cultures talk about this. It's not like one or two cultures talk about gods in the sky battling it out. They all talk about something in the sky battling it out. They all talk about losing continents or gaining land during massive earthquakes. All of the cultures that we go back and study, they all have these weird events. So why? Why do these exist? Is it that every single human back in the past, or humans in general, just has a natural affinity to just making up crazy, catastrophic stories? That's literally one of the excuses that the mainstream will use. They will actually tell you, oh, it's just in human DNA to just make stuff up like this and write it down and incorporate it into their lives. Yes, we all have this natural urge to write down huge battles of gods in the sky. I've never done that. I have never had an urge to be like, oh, you know what? You know what would be really cool is if I just made up gods fighting in the sky for some weird reason. I've never had that feeling ever in my life. You know, I have never looked up at the planet Mars in our sky, if I can even find it, right? 99% of people would never be able to find Mars, but I would never look up and find Mars and be like, wow, that's like the god of war. Look at all the destruction that it's doing to Earth. Right? That's the kind of writing that we see from the ancient cultures, and this is completely pushed aside by mainstream historians. They look at these kinds of stories and they're like, oh yeah, they saw Mars up there. I guess they tracked it and then they made it the god of war. Okay, so even if just one culture did that, that would be weird. That would be really weird that even one culture would, for whatever reason, look up to Mars, for example, and say, that's the god of war. Like, that's kind of weird, but all right, you could say, well, if one culture did it, maybe there was a weird dude, he made some stuff up, and then it caught on. Okay, all right, fine, you know, it could happen. It could happen. But when we have cultures all over the world talking about how Mars is the god of war, there's a problem. Because why would every single culture across the planet look up to Mars and call Mars the destructor? Call Mars the god of war? Why? Why would any culture do that? One culture is already hard enough, but why would every single one do it? Right? So, but they all do it. This fact is ignored by the mainstream. Why is it ignored by the mainstream? You would think that if these people were approaching historical topics in a scientific, thoughtful, critical thinking manner, that one of the things you would see is you would be like, well, okay, hold on, everybody. All of the ancient cultures in the past have this story. We should probably figure out why. No, they don't do any of that. They literally ignore it. Comparative mythology does not even exist in the mainstream. Comparative mythology is a legitimate science. Like, that is something that should be studied ad nauseum by every single person digging into any kind of ancient history. But the mainstream ignores it. Now, the alternative historical research community, they don't necessarily ignore it, but they're also not on top of it in the way they should be. Even they kind of write it off too easily. And the reason why is simple. It's very simple psychology. What is being described by our ancient ancestors simply is not happening right in front of people in today's day and age. And that's it. That is literally all it takes to discard whatever our ancient ancestors are saying. It doesn't take any kind of psychological brainwashing campaign. It doesn't take anything. A human lives and dies by its five senses. It paints its reality by its five senses. We could say six senses, once again, different topic. But if something that is described by our ancient ancestors in the past is not happening right now, it's very difficult for your average human to believe it. to take it seriously. And I do not blame anybody for this, right? Your average person doesn't care about any of this, right? Your average person does not care about ancient Egypt or ancient Mayans or Aztecs or any of these civilizations, right? Your average person has no clue and they don't care. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's unfortunate, but it's fine, whatever. But for those people who are actually trying to study this kind of stuff, you cannot allow yourself to fall into that trap. You have to be aware of that trap, because once you fall into that trap, it can be very difficult to dig your way out of it. Let's look at it like this. So, mainstream historians over the past few hundred years have dug one hell of a hole into the ground. And this hole, they have convinced themselves and their colleagues, is the correct way to live. So everybody jumps down into this hole, right? And they have other people promoting it. Hey, jump into the hole. It's pretty cool down there, right? And so more and more people start to jump down into the hole. So as more and more people jump into the hole, the people who don't jump into the hole start to look like crazy people, right? If you question the hole, you're like, why the hell are you jumping in that hole? And they're like, well, there's a party down there and everybody's down there. Why wouldn't you jump into the hole? It's fun. Let's go. They jump in, but you step back and you're like, yeah, but that's not good. It's a hole. And you know what? It's going to be really hard to get out of that hole, right? But everybody jumps into it, right? So as that hole gets bigger and more people jump into it and other people out of the hole are convinced that the hole is correct, we find ourselves stuck in a position to where the majority stuck in a hole start to run things, right? Their propaganda starts to spread like crazy to the people not in the hole, and the hole gets bigger because more people jump into it. So if you as a critical thinker are able to look at the hole and question it and not jump in, suddenly you're going to become the enemy to the people in the hole, right? So we eventually find ourselves in a position to where the critical thinkers will remain outside of the hole and they will be ostracized, and then everybody in the hole has no problem partying it up and then buying into all the garbage going on in the hole. It's comfortable, it's fine. I only point this out because it's a psychological problem that you have to be aware of when you are taking on catastrophism as a topic, because you're going to get a lot of flack for it. That's the one thing of everything that I have noticed is the absolute vitriol that a lot of people on both sides of the academic spectrum throw at catastrophism, right? And unfortunately, that scares a lot of really good thinkers away from the topic. I only point all of this out because it is one of the problems that catastrophism has to deal with as it tries to gain momentum in the scientific arena as well as the historical arena. Now, the interesting and good news is that catastrophism has the bleeding and leading edge on both of those topics, which is ironic because it has the most evidence supporting it and it has the least amount of people following it. And that's one hell of a critique on today's Western society, by the way, right? I mean, people always say they're following the evidence, but then when the evidence says something they don't like, yeah, they don't follow the evidence. So step one in getting into catastrophism is putting aside all of your biases. Bias is a horrible thing to have in critical thinking, and it's one of the main things that needs to be eliminated as a critical thinker. So that's something to work on. And I've covered that in one of my earlier videos. Or go watch somebody else's video on critical thinking. It doesn't even matter. Critical thinking is important, and getting rid of a bias is one of the number one things that you have to train yourself to do. Now, once you've gotten rid of your bias, you can start looking at the evidence for catastrophism. One of the things you are going to find when you start rereading ancient cultures' histories is you are going to start finding all ancient cultures talking about the same events. This is the first bullet point that you have to remember when you start dealing with catastrophism. If something crazy happened in our past, especially up in the night sky, right? If there was some sort of huge cosmological event, that means that the planet is going to see this, right? It's not going to be one village in Africa or one village in the North America. It's going to be everybody across the planet. And of course, the larger scale of the event, the more people on the planet are going to see it. So, this is one of the first pieces of major evidence that we have that corroborates catastrophism being real. If something crazy happened in the cosmological sky, everybody should have been witness to it. And if there was something that crazy going on in the sky, and I don't just mean a small little comet, that we see that, like that's enough proof, right? but we have huge amounts of destruction going on in the night sky. Sure enough, we find that all cultures all over this planet document said destruction. Now, the next point that's interesting regarding their eyewitness testimony is that we have eyewitness testimony to what happened. So instead of looking at an ancient culture's mythology or legends as simply fiction, some sort of crazy thing these people made up, start reading it as if it's real. This is probably one of the first major hurdles that you are going to have to deal with if you decide to get into catastrophism. The first thing you have to get into the mindset of doing is being able to look at an ancient culture's history, and instead of just throwing it off as fiction or trying to interpret in some sort of a weird allegorical way or whatever, instead of all of that, take it serious. So when the Greeks say that Zeus threw a thunderbolt in the sky, take that as fact. They saw what they called Zeus in the sky throwing a thunderbolt. Like, just why not? Just for fun. Don't worry about it. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't hurt you to think differently. So don't worry about it. Just pretend it's real. Why not? So let's use my Zeus thing right here really quick. So in Greek mythology, we have Zeus throwing a thunderbolt at Typhon. Okay. All right. So I'm going to guess that you right now are imagining some old dude, some old buff dude in a white robe with thunderbolts in his ears, throwing a bolt at lightning at another god-looking guy named Typhon and hitting him in the back or whatever. Is that what you pictured? Did you picture two humanoid figures in the sky throwing a thunderbolt and getting hit by a thunderbolt? Is that how you pictured that? If you didn't, great. So hold on a sec. You just chill. But if you're one of the many people that probably did, the very first question that I would pose to you is, why did you think of that picture? Why not something else? Why did you decide that there were two human figures in the sky throwing a thunderbolt and getting hit by a thunderbolt? Where did that come from? I didn't tell you to picture a human. I didn't tell you to picture a humanoid. I just told you to picture something named Zeus and something named Typhon being in the act of dealing with electricity. That's all I told you. Now, if you thought about humanoid figures, where did that come from? That's a very good question. Now, we know where it came from. It came from the general concept of how Western ideologies picture these kind of mythologies, right? This is a cultural thing that we have in the West. Whenever we think about a god of any religion, really nowadays, more or less, we always think about some sort of a human. And of course, one of the main pictures of a god is a dude with a beard and a robe, right? That's like the main thing nowadays. And that permeates all of culture. So if you immediately went to that kind of a picture of two humans having a battle in the sky, that's weird. Like, that's technically weird because we didn't say anything like that. And the stories don't say that either. The stories never describe Zeus as a dude, huge buff dude, long flowing white beard, thunderbolts in his ears, walking around up in the sky. He's not doing any of this. There's nothing like that in the stories. That is what the stories have turned into over time. Right? Now, even our older ancestors are at fault for some of this as well, for humanizing some of this. Because once these events that happened in the sky were no longer happening in the sky, even the newer Greeks, they lost the histories of what happened to their ancestors too. So when they were looking at their ancient ancestors' histories, they suffered the same problem that we suffered now. Not as bad, but they had the same problem of trying to figure out what the hell were they talking about. Right? I don't see Zeus up there. What's going on? What was going on? Right? So they carried on the traditions still, but they humanized it as well. But the original stories say nothing at all about two humans in the sky fighting. It just doesn't exist, right? So the point of me bringing this up is to show you how your current culture will control your psychology and your outlook when you start to study an ancient history. So my challenge to you is to erase all of that. Get rid of all of the mainstream stuff in your head that you've been told is true or that you've seen on cartoons and movies and all that garbage. Get rid of all of that. That's your first challenge. Get rid of it all. Once you clear your mind of all of these weird perceived notions, you can now start to look at the ancient histories in a new light. Now I'm going to keep using the Zeus example here. And I want to use this example to illustrate how tough it's going to be for a lot of people to start to understand and get into the realities of catastrophism. And I only want to point this out because I don't want you to think that it's easy, because it's not. It will take some work, but I promise you the work is worth it. All right, so we have Zeus, we have Typhon, we have a thunderbolt being thrown between the two bodies. All right, what else can we interpret this as? All right, well, what else is Zeus? All right, if he's not a human, fine. What else is Zeus in Greek history? Well, what else is Zeus? He's also a planet. He is a planet, and this is not an interpretation. This is directly from the histories. Typhon is a planet. Once again, directly from the history. These are not allegories. These are not fantasies. This is what the original stories say. Two planets exchanged a lightning bolt. I'm going to say that one more time. Two planets exchanged a lightning bolt. There is nothing unscientific about that possibility. Zero. That is 100% scientifically possible for two planets to exchange an electrical charge. Now, isn't this amazing? All I did was look at the original story without any of the westernized garbage, and I read it for exactly what it said. Two planets exchanging electricity. Suddenly, we have now gone from the realm of fantasy, two men in robes and throwing lightning bolts or whatever, fighting in the sky. We have now moved from that fantasy to a scientific reality. Two electrically charged bodies zap each other to find that equilibrium electrically. That is 100% scientific. So in one step, one move, one change in perspective, all we did was read the literature for what it actually says. We have now moved from fantasy to reality. Scientific reality, which is even better. Now, for the skeptics, you could start saying ba, and that's fine. But you can't say that that is not a scientific possibility. We know for a fact it is. Now, the next problem that you can bring up, though, is you can say, well, how did those two planets zap each other? The planets are all generally far apart. How does that happen? How do you get an electrical spark between two planets? All right, well, first of all, technically, distance doesn't necessarily matter if we start talking about plasma physics. It all deals with charge, etc. We won't go into that right now. So distance is not necessarily relevant for the actual event to take place. But in the case of the Greek story, we have these two planets rather close to each other in the night sky. I mean, they're right there. They're not little pinpricks of light for the Greeks back in this time, for the ancient Greeks. For example, the Greeks were well aware of what Jupiter looked like. We have plenty of evidence that where they describe the bands on Jupiter, right? It's there whether you like it or not. I won't get into that either, but if we find evidence like that, that just proves that Jupiter had to have been closer to planet Earth at that point in time. Now, right there, you're probably going crazy. You're probably like, well, what are you talking about? Jupiter's way out there. If Jupiter was closer, wouldn't everything change? Yes, of course everything would change. Ding, ding, ding. Now you've got it. And now you can start to see what our ancestors went through. If our ancestors say they saw two planets zap each other in the sky and they're relatively close, and not only were they zapping each other, but they were close enough to also affect Earth. Earth is affected as well. Earth is not an island in any of these events. Earth is entangled in all of this. And once again, all of the stories corroborate that. So now you might be saying, well, it's pretty far-fetched to say that there are planets closer to Earth than they are now. Really? Is that scientifically far-fetched? Ask yourself this objectively. Now, if you don't know the basic science behind a lot of this, it isn't that hard to go look around to see what's up. But no, the answer is no. There is nothing in science that says what the ancient Greeks saw and recorded, and all the other cultures, by the way, recorded this event as well. What all of these people saw and recorded is all 100% technically, scientifically possible. There's no mysticism here. There is no made-up theory. We don't need any of it. We can just use 100% real science to explain what the ancient Greeks saw during this event. Now, this is where a lot of people start to run into problems. This is where our psychological conditioning as a culture starts to become unsteady and it starts to kick in all of the defense mechanisms. So what I just said now will probably sound crazy to a lot of people. The fact that ancient Greeks may have seen Jupiter and another planet pretty damn close to Earth, how do you deal with that? Most people don't know how to deal with it other than saying, no, you're wrong. Why? Why am I wrong? Why is that claim wrong? It's not scientifically wrong. We know that for a scientific fact. So that's your first problem. You want to say, if you want to take the position that that could not possibly happen, you have to prove that it didn't or that it couldn't. So right now, scientifically, it can. All of our scientific data that we now currently have, especially when you start to integrate plasma physics, making the claim that Jupiter could have been closer to planet Earth only a few thousand years ago is not an impossibility. It certainly is not a scientific impossibility. So for example, right now we have the moon that orbits us. It's a decent sized body. It's not small, right? We have no problem orbiting, the moon has no problem orbiting us, right? We're good, we're fine. We have other large bodies that orbit things like Jupiter and Saturn, right? So we have and know for a fact that planetary-sized bodies, like Titan, for example, has no problem orbiting its parent planet. It lives just fine. All right, it's not crumbling, it's not falling apart. Planets can easily orbit close to each other, and the sizes are, well, they're not irrelevant, but there's no problem with different sized bodies orbiting one another close by. So you can't say that Jupiter could not have been closer to Earth. You can't make that statement. It's scientifically inaccurate. So then the next thing we have to say is, why make the statement at all? Well, for the exact reason we just talked about with Zeus. Zeus is Jupiter. If the Greeks say that they were able to see Zeus fighting another planet, Typhon, they must have seen it. Why make it up? Then the next thing you can say, of course, is, well, fine, maybe, okay, fine, I'll take that like as fact. But then that means other cultures must have seen it as well. Yep, tons of other cultures saw it, and every single other culture has their analogous myths, just like the Greeks. So when I say catastrophism is a legitimate science to start to study and to start to get into, I've just made a case that scientifically it is a viable route to understanding our ancient culture. So here's my challenge to you as an historian or an ancient historical researcher that is looking for the truth, that is trying to figure something out. Because you're probably here because you're probably tired of the mainstream stuff, because the mainstream stuff has led nowhere. Same thing with me. I was getting tired of history because the mainstream chronology and the mainstream historical setup and explanations, they weren't leading anywhere. They weren't explaining anything. They weren't doing anything. Everything was just this weird pile of gray garbage. Catastrophism gets us out of that garbage. Catastrophism starts to explain why our ancestors did what they did, why they recorded what they recorded, and how they ended, and why we are now where we are now. Catastrophism has the potential to scientifically explain what happened in ancient history. So my challenge to you is to not ignore something like Velikovsky. Don't ignore the electric universe. Don't ignore all of the ancient cultures' histories that talk about these gods doing things in the sky. Here's a tip for you. Every time you're reading an ancient culture's history, replace the word God with planet. Then see what happens to the story. All right, I'm losing my voice. So what I want to do then in the future is I will make some other introductory videos to other aspects of catastrophism to help everybody out. The only thing I ask of you as a newer person to the catastrophism community is to just keep an open mind. Why would you not keep an open mind? We obviously do not know what happened in ancient history. There's a reason why the subject is generally shrouded in mystery. It's there, it's objectively shrouded. We know that. So keep an open mind whenever you start to hear this kind of stuff. The funny thing is that you as a skeptic or you as a beginner just getting into this stuff, you may be the person that solves some of the crazier problems that we have right now in catastrophe. And you can only do that if you keep an open mind. So hopefully you're that person that one day we can all look up to and be like, that dude or that woman or whoever figured it out. They're the one with the open mind. They listened and they were the one that made the difference.